It's not like we need another video about the G1000, but I have recently upgraded from using the 530 to the G1000, and I was surprised that there was quite a learning curve. I had gotten pretty good at shooting approaches with the 530 using the S-Tech 550 autopilot, and when I went to the G1000 it was a disaster. I didn't have too much trouble with the flight planning because it's the same pretty much as the 530, and the lateral control was not too challenging either, but I had a real struggle with the vertical guidance. Now of course Philipp Ringler is the master, and I've watched his videos a bunch of times and I highly recommend them. In fact, I put a link to the pertinent one in the description. I certainly don't claim to be any kind of authority, but having yet another video on this subject seems appropriate as you get to witness a beginner struggling to master this instrument. So here we are south of Fayetteville Regional KFAY, and I'm just flying straight and level on a heading bug with autopilot on while I get set up. So let me pause it right here. And as you can see, we're probably about 10 miles southeast of the airport, which gives us plenty of time to get established on the Zaji transition. And I've put a simple direct to KFAY in the flight plan. And I'm loading up the procedure for the ILS Runway 04 with the transition to Zaji. And since we're south of the approach, we don't need to fly the course reversal, so we'll say no to this question. Now, in order to determine our minimums, we need to take a look at our approach plate. We see under the category ILS 4 we have a decision altitude of 389 feet. And while we're looking at this, there's two other altitudes that we're interested in. One is the approach altitude coming into Zaji, and we see that that's 2,300 feet. And then we're interested in the altitude at the final approach fix, Sinlo, and we see that's 1,900 feet. And you'll see why those altitudes are important as we go along here. Our barrel minimum needs to be 389, but we can't enter that. The closest we can get is 400. And since we're only a few miles out, we'll go ahead and activate the approach. So now our flight plan starts at the ILS approach to runway 4 at the transition Zaji. And it's showing here that the transition altitude into Zaji is 1,900 feet, but my chart shows 2,300 because my charts are out of date. So I'm going to change this to 2,300. So now I think we're ready to start flying the approach. And since we're heading to the approach, the first thing we need to do is set our altitude to 2,300 for the transition. And we'll switch into nav mode to follow the flight plan. And we'll start about a 900 foot per minute descent so that we get to the 2,300 feet by the time we get to the transition. And the G1000 does lots of things automatic for us, but one thing it does not do is manage our throttle. That is completely our job throughout. So as I'm descending here, I need to be very careful to keep my speed under control, and I'm trying to keep it somewhere around 100 knots. And the other big responsibility we have is to keep our eyes on these three boxes. Anything in green is currently active. So we have GPS active, we have the autopilot active, and we have a vertical speed of negative 900 feet per minute. Then in white, we see ALTS. Anything in white is a future event. In other words, it's heading in that direction. So what we have is ALTS, and the S means set, meaning that we've set it, but it hasn't actually happened yet. Now when it does reach our target altitude, in this case 2300, then the ALTS in white will turn to ALT in green. And it's been a painful lesson to learn that the G1000 will change modes on you and you think you're in autopilot when you're not, and things like that. That's why you have to keep a really close eye on these boxes. If the G1000 can't accomplish a task for whatever reason, like you ask it to climb too fast and it induce a stall, then the autopilot will drop out and revert back to flight director. So I've thought I was in autopilot and I look up and I see FD, which is flight director. And of course these are all safety issues that the 530 just doesn't have. So the learning curve continues. So you see right here I'm in flight director mode, thinking I was in autopilot, so I need to take care of that. And we need to click the nav button to get into navigation mode to follow the flight plan. So in the next 12 seconds we're coming up on the Disengaging transition, and we'll see that two things happen automatically. First one, which happened already and happened when you first activated the approach, and that is the ILS frequency for the approach gets loaded into the active radios, both COM1 and COM2. And that identifier in this case is IGRA. If you look on the approach plate, you see that's 110.5. And the second thing that happens automatically is the CDI switches from GPS mode to the localizer, and this happens a few seconds after crossing the initial approach fix. If this was an RNAV approach, this switch would not occur since we're using GPS for guidance all the way to landing. So we just crossed over the initial approach fix Disengaging. In a few seconds we should get the automatic localizer switch over. And there it is. And we can verify on the chart that our localizer frequency 110.5 is indeed set in our Nav1 radio. Before we get to the final approach fix, we need to engage approach mode that will give us vertical as well as enhanced lateral guidance. We hit the approach button to do that. Once approach mode is engaged, we'll see a white GS in the third box telling us that glide slope is anticipated but has not yet been captured. Once it gets captured, it will of course turn green. Now while we're between the intermediate and the final approach fixes, this is a good time to do our GUMPS, and we'll drop a notch of flaps. Our next important task is to get down to final approach fixed altitude, which we recall from the plate to be 1900 feet. And we need to get this done before we get to the final approach fix, SINLO in this case. And it's important to be under the glide slope and fly into it rather than be too high, because if you're too high you can miss it altogether and you'll never capture. I've done this a number of times and realized that. As you can see, the little green diamond is well above us, so we are under the glide slope here and still outside SINLO, so we'll fly right into the glide slope, so it should have no trouble capturing. So there we are, we've captured. So the only job we have left is to make sure that our airspeed is where we want it. And I'm trying to keep mine between 70 and 75. So when I come off autopilot right at the threshold, I can drop another notch of flaps if I want to and be real close to the speed I want for landing. So we can just sit back and relax and ride the beam. I'm not sure what that porpoising is. I'm thinking maybe it's my analog trim that's causing that. It'd be interesting just to hear from others that use button trim if it does that. Once I get to the threshold, I'm going to go missed approach just to show you how easy it is with the G1000. So I'm looking at the approach plate. Okay, so runway heading to 1100 feet, then a climbing right turn to 3000 feet to the GANS intersection. Okay, I've turned autopilot off. So go full power, flaps up. And as you can see, we're in flight director mode now. I'm going to turn the autopilot back on and go into heading mode. Buy me a little time. And I'm going to use flight level change mode to climb out at a comfortable 98 knots. Mr. Ringler says use flight level change mode when you're climbing and vertical speed when you're diving, so I'm trying to learn it that way. We'll take the OBS button out of suspend, which when we switch back to nav mode allows us to follow the flight plan to the missed approach point. Next we need to take the CDI out of localizer mode and put it back in GPS. Now we can switch to nav mode and we'll follow the flight plan up to the missed approach point. Now the only task left is to set our altitude to 3,000 feet, and that completes the missed approach procedure. And if you had a toga button, it would set all this stuff up for you, and maybe sometime I'll investigate doing that. Now, pretending that ATC is vectored us back to the original ILS procedure, we'll just reset to the transition ZAGI and start the process all over again. So I'll just spare you the details on that, since it's pretty much exactly the same as what you've already seen, and we'll wrap this whole thing up by looking at some of the lessons we've learned. So what have we learned? I have discovered that throttle control is the most important aspect of this. In addition to the safety issue, I found that too much airspeed during the final approach caused the autopilot to climb and not stay on glide slope very well. Likewise, too little causes it to fall under glide slope. So setting the throttle in the 70 to 75 knot range seemed to work really well. The second thing is to keep a sharp eye on those 3 status boxes. It's very easy for the autopilot to kick itself out of autopilot mode and put you in flight director. You may not realize that, and that can certainly get you into trouble. And those 3 boxes describe everything that the G1000 is doing. And with so many things that the G1000 does automatically, it's really important just to pay attention to those boxes. The third thing is to descend to the published altitudes that are in the approach plate. The 2 that are important are the initial approach fix and the final approach fix. And the reason that this is important is because you want to fly into the glide slope from beneath and capture rather than be above the glide slope, because it's very difficult for the G1000 to capture glide slope if you're above it. The fourth thing is it's important to understand what the G1000 does automatically and when it does those things. The ILS frequencies are automatically loaded into the nav radios when you activate the approach procedure. The CDI automatically switches to the localizer mode when you first enter the final approach leg of the approach. I tend to not like automatic things, and it's really helpful for me to understand when these things happen so that I can stay on top of it and not be surprised by what's happening. And finally, when do you transition from nav mode to approach mode? Well, I have found that the best time to do that is as soon as the CDI switches into localizer mode. At that point, you can go into approach and you'll be fine. Well, I hope this has been educational and not just a rehash of so many of the other videos that are out there on this subject. And I thought this was important because I'm addressing the problems that I've had, and I suspect you might have them as well. So I hope they've helped. And I really encourage you to watch Philipp Ringler's videos on the G1000, as they are second to none.